Hello, class. Welcome to week 15 of our anthropology lecture. This week, we're going to be focusing in on the topic of biological variation. And the two main types of variation we're going to look at are ideas about race and gender. And to look at both of these, we're going to look at some assumptions about categories. I'm going to explain this idea of biological determinism, and we're going to compare a historical perspective with a sort of more modern perspective of these categories. Okay, to get started, I want to remind you of where we left off last week. So we were talking about the origins and spread of Homo sapiens, of our species. And what we looked at was this idea, right? We had looked at the debate between the out of Africa versus the replacement ideas. And this was the new theory that replaced the two older ones that best fit the evidence we had, right? So what we end up with is that our species, Homo sapiens, evolved in Africa 200,000 years ago. We stayed in Africa for about the first 140,000 years of our existence, went through some major drought, population crash, developed our fully modern minds, our cognitive abilities and intelligence. And then when the weather improved, our population grew and we expanded out of Africa into Asia, eventually reaching Australia and Europe and the Americas. And as Homo sapiens spread around, they did occasionally interbreed with some of the other hominin species out there, like Homo neanderthalensis. So there's a little bit of genes from some of those other species, but the bulk of our DNA comes from African origins. So that's where we covered last week. And I believe I also showed you this map for the little summary of sort of our movements. Right? We evolved in Africa 200,000 years ago, spread out around 60,000 years ago, move into Asia over the next 10,000 years, around 50,000 years ago. Then into Australia 45,000 years ago, into Europe around 40,000 years ago, had sex with some Neanderthals during that time. And then eventually, way later, moved into the Americas by crossing the land bridge up here about 15,000 years ago. So that was last week, right? Talking about the spread of Homo sapiens all over the globe. So now we have Homo sapiens everywhere. So now we're going to look at some biological variations that we see in this big, massive global species. And we're going to talk about race. And my setup for this is that how we're going to look at it is looking at some assumptions that have been historically made about race. And that's the idea that there are just a few discontinuous categories, a few discontinuous racial categories. And if you remember from, how many weeks ago was it now? 3 or 4 weeks ago, I've lost track. 3 or 4 weeks ago, we had that article called The Salamander's Tale by Richard Dawkins. And that article talked about speciation and brought up this concept of categories and how to categorize people. And one of the examples I gave you was blood types, that blood types are discontinuous discrete categories, right? There's only 4 major blood types, A, B, and O. So it is very easy to categorize people into these 4 categories versus continuous variation. And we talked about like heights, right? And I mentioned how in that kind of system, it's, how many different heights are there? Sort of an infinite number, okay? So I had talked about that a few weeks ago, and partly in talking about our species debates we had during the hominin fossil evolution section and partly to set up this week. Okay. So the historical assumptions about race is that racial categories are discontinuous, right? There's a few racial categories, and they are discrete and discontinuous from each other, and that racial categories are strictly biologically determined, right? Kind of like blood type. Okay. So this assumption we are going to look at and examine a bit. And similarly, we're going to look at the ideas of sex and gender and the assumption that there are two discontinuous categories under sex and gender, which you are probably very familiar with, male and female. And again, this idea that this is strictly biologically determined. So that's what we're going to do this week, okay, is look at these two concepts. So let's take a closer look and get into this topic. And to start off with, what I want you to do is the articles here this week come in right in the beginning of lecture. This is where they're most relevant. So as I say every week at this point, right, pause my lecture, go watch the student presentation on these two articles, participate in the discussion, then come back here and I'll pick up with these articles and some ideas from these articles. But go watch the student presentation first, and I will wait patiently here. Okay. Oops. Okay. So now that you have watched the student presentation and participated in the discussion and talked about the questions they had, I will pick up there and talk about some things from the articles. So I'm going to start with the gender article, and then I'll get to the race article. Okay. So gender. As I was saying for my setup, is you guys are familiar with the gender categories of male and female, and you probably have had to fill out many a form in your life talking about that. So this article, the Sapolsky article, is looking at these concepts of sex and gender. And he starts out by talking about the idea of sex. Okay. And he is a biologist. So he wants to take a look at biological sex categories in nature, because one of the things you will often hear around this, when there's a debate about the idea of sex and gender, is sometimes people tie the two together and say gender is just simply sex, right? Male or female. And you will hear people say, sometimes your relatives, sometimes politicians will say, and it's really simple, it's just simple biology. You are either male or female. That's the simple biology of it. That's nature. That's all there is. Easy peasy. The discussion is over. Okay, so Sapolsky wants to look at this idea of, is sex simple in nature? Is it as simple as male and female and that's it? So he brings up some very interesting examples in his article. He talks a little bit about plants, and he says, well, some plants, are male and some are female, but some plants are called monoecious, where they have both male and female organs in the same tree, right? They can produce pollen and they can produce flowers and fruit. So in plants, the sex categories are not always as simple as straightforward as that's a male plant, that's a female plant. Okay, but you may be thinking, oh, plants, who cares? Plants are weird. So he goes on to talk about animals and gives a bunch of interesting interesting examples about animals. And what does he talk about in that article? He talks about some animals are what you would call parthenogenic, okay? And these are some species where females can reproduce without males. I heard about this when I was an undergraduate in New Mexico because there was a species of lizard there at the university campus that was parthenogenic, is that females could have babies all on their own without mating with any male. They could basically clone themselves. And this pops up in a few reptiles and some fish. You hear it, it comes up in the news every now and then. Almost every year or two, you'll see a news story headline saying, you know, in a zoo or in an aquarium, unexpected babies, right? And you read about it, and they'll say, hey, they had this shark that was in a tank all by herself for years and years and years. And then one day, the keepers come in and there's babies in the tank, right? And they're like, oh my God, what the hell happened? Did somebody sneak a shark in here at night? I've seen this news headline pop up with sharks. I've seen it pop up with snakes a few times. Is that, a female by herself in an enclosure for a decade, and then suddenly she's got babies. And it turns out that they didn't realize, these species were parthenogenic, is that in the absence of males, females can clone themselves and produce fertilized eggs. These species females can usually mate with males when they're around, but it's sort of a backup plan, right? Is that if there are no suitable males, then they go ahead and have their own babies. So might be a nice idea for some of you if you're looking to have kids someday but don't want to bother with males, just to clone yourself. Too bad you're not a shark or a reptile. All right. Then there's some other examples out there called pseudo-hermaphrodites. And these are species where they're not true hermaphrodites, but the genitals of the females look male. And the example he talks about in the article, and one of the best known examples is hyenas, right? Spotted hyenas. When researchers first went out to study hyenas, they were very confused because all they found were males. And they're like, what's going on? Where are the females? Turns out female spotted hyenas have very large pendulous clitorises that look pretty much like a penis. So they saw all the hyenas had penises and they were confused, but no, some of them were just females. And how it turns out is that in hyenas, they are what's called a highly androgenized species, where females have a lot of androgen and testosterone, those typical male hormones, right? And they have high testosterone. So in the womb, when the babies are developing, the high testosterone rate, the high amounts of testosterone cause the clitoris to grow large. I think I mentioned this to you way back in the beginning of the semester about vestigial structures, saying, a penis and a clitoris are basically the same thing. It's just you hit a clitoris with a lot of testosterone, it turns into a penis. So that's what's going on with the hyenas. Hyenas are very interesting species. They're female dominant. Females are highly androgenized and aggressive, and female-female competition is what it's all about and leads to reproductive success. So they're an interesting species to look into. Then there are other species that would be called synchronous hermaphrodites, or sort of true hermaphrodites. Individuals have the sex organs of both sexes. Individuals have male and female sexual organs. One of the best examples of synchronous hermaphrodites would be slugs and snails. And I don't know, have you guys ever watched a video of slugs having sex? Yes? No? No? Are you telling me it's just me that watches videos of slugs having sex? You guys are missing out. I recommend you go Google leopard snail mating. There's a really nice video narrated by David Attenborough that shows you, what did I say, leopard snail? I meant leopard slug, sorry, leopard slug mating. You get to watch a cool video narrated by Attenborough of two slugs mating, and it's magical. It's crazy. Basically, they, get together and, dangle from a branch and intertwine with each other, and they have both sex organs. So, both use their little slug penis to inseminate the other one. They knock each other up in this cool little glow-in-the-dark translucent ball of slime and amazingness, and then they go on about their ways. So they're hermaphrodite species out there. So again, go watch the leopard slug video on your own. You will never look at slugs again the same after that. So what else do we see? We see in animals what's called sequential hermaphrodites, is that an individual can change from male to female under the right circumstances, meaning they have been going about their life as a male, and then usually an environmental trigger will change them from male to female. A good example of this is clownfish, right? Is that when there are no females around, or when the dominant female of the area of the coral reef or the group goes away, the most dominant male will go through hormonal changes and turn into a female, and then mate and have babies. So I just want to point out that example because you guys may have been familiar growing up with the movie Finding Nemo. You remember that little cartoon about the clownfish? If that had been more biologically accurate, it would have played out a little bit differently, right? In the beginning of the movie, what was it? The mom, I forget, I think her name was Coral or something. The mom dies, and then the dad, Marlin, was that his name? The dad, has to raise Nemo all on his own. Well, the clownfish are a sequential hermaphrodite species. So in nature, when the female is gone, the most dominant male, Marlin, would have turned into Marlena and then mated with whatever little males were around. So very different movie in nature than it was in that was it Disney Pixar version. Okay, so there's a number of fish species that can do that. And then the other category that you see are what's called bidirectional hermaphrodites. And these are species where individuals can actually switch back and forth, multiple times in both directions throughout their life, sort of depending on circumstances. Again, you see this a lot in fish. So imagine, showing up to a party and looking around and saying, I think last weekend female worked, but I think I'm going to be male here. So a lot more exciting options for those species. All right. So basically, all these examples show sex, those two categories of male and female are not always rigidly defined, and they are not always as clear cut as just either male or female, and nothing else. So biology and nature are more complex than some people realize. And he brings up some experiments done with lab mice, right, in mammals. So lab mice, what they've found out is, they do all sorts of weird experiments with lab mice, and they found out that their brains have the circuitry, the wiring for both males and female behaviors, right? But in males, the male part of their brain is very active, and is used. And in female mice, the female part of their brain is sort of active and used, but both circuitries are there for different kinds of instinctual behaviors, especially around mating for male and female mice. So what scientists have done, because scientists are weird, is, they've stuck little electrodes into the brains of these lab mice. And what they found out is they can basically artificially stimulate the behaviors of the other sex to show up, right? They can take a male mouse and, zap the female part of his brain, and he will start exhibiting female behaviors, right? And they can take a female mouse and zap the male parts of her brain and stimulate them and make her start acting like a male. So again, both aspects of male and female are in there, but there's some interesting variation going on. All right, so this leads him, he uses this as a setup for discussion about humans, right? Because humans aren't quite as excitingly awesome as some of these species that can do some of these more dramatic changes. But what he does talk about are humans have some interesting chromosome and hormone disorders. Okay? So you guys are probably familiar with the idea of the sex chromosomes, right? The X and Y chromosomes. And typically females have two X chromosomes and males have an X and a Y. Okay. And those are the sort of sex typical chromosome patterns for humans. So again, you'll sometimes hear people who don't know that much about science, like politicians, talking about, oh, this, sex and gender, it's not that complicated. You just, do a blood test and you can see the chromosomes, right? Two X's, it's a female, an X and a Y, it's a male. Simple, done, that's all there is. Turns out, no, that's not all there is, right? Those two are just the typical patterns that we see in humans, but there's a lot of other patterns that show up with humans. Some people can have 3 X chromosomes, Some people can have 1. Some people have 2 X's and 1 Y. Some people have an X and 2 Ys. Some people have 2 X's and 2 Ys, right? So actually, there's a whole range of chromosome patterns that you can see in people, right? These ones tend to be more rare than the typical XX or XY, but they're out there. And, depending on the different types of chromosomes, they can have different effects on the person and on their body. But those kinds of variations are there in people if you look closely enough. What you can also find is that even in stereotypical chromosomally, is that a word? Chromosome? In typical chromosome, sex typical chromosome, males and females. Sure, I'll go with that term. Even if the people are somewhat typical, what you can find is men, XY men, often if you look around through their body, you can find some cells have 2 X's, right? And these may be cells that they might have picked up from their mom in utero. So these are female cells floating around in their body, and they're stem cells. So stem cells, as you may know, can go on to develop into other types of cells. Sometimes they can develop into neurons in the brain and other parts of the body. And women, right? What you see there is women who have had sons. It looks like there's a bit of cell exchange going on there during pregnancy. And you can find cells that are XY. You can find male cells floating around in different parts of their body that they picked up from their sons in utero. So his point here, Sapolsky's point, is that many people are what you would call sex chromosome mosaics, right? they may be mostly male and mostly female, but depending on what you sample, there may be cells in your body that look like the other sex. And there are many people out there with variations in their sex chromosomes. And sex chromosomes are important for sex determination, right? Because what they do is they regulate hormone levels in the body. Right? The X chromosome regulates hormones like estrogen, and the Y chromosome regulates hormones like testosterone. And then, as I've mentioned a few times, hormone levels determine the body phenotype, right? So if you are, a little baby in the uterus starting to develop and you have two X chromosomes, those pump out, more estrogen, and that determines how your body is shaped and developed. So you come out looking like a girl. If you have a Y chromosome, then that shapes your growth and development and you come out looking male. But Sapolsky brings up that there are many hormonal disorders that sort of alter this and shape this and create atypical patterns in people's bodies. So he gives a bunch of different examples here where, different balance of the hormones in your body. Some people are born with a uterus and with testicles. Some people are born with both ovaries and testicles. There's a condition where some people are born where they have a mutation in this enzyme. Okay. And that means in utero, in the womb, not much testosterone, right? Not many male hormones are produced. So the baby comes out, and when the doctors and the parents look at it, it's like, oh, there's no penis there, it's female. So the kid then spends the next, 12 years being treated as a girl. But then when the kid goes through puberty, then this enzyme finally starts kicking in, and finally pumps out all the testosterone that should have been there in the first place. And the body gets flooded with testosterone and the clitoris develops into a penis, right? And I was like, oh, oops, I guess you were male all along. There's this other condition called testicular feminization syndrome, where the kid, again, appears to have a female body as a child. But then when they hit puberty, right, when they, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 years old, they never have their period. The parents take them into the doctor and say, what's going on? And they do sort of a sonogram and look around in there and they say, oh, your testicles are internal. I guess you were a boy all along. So he's trying to show you there's lots of instances where, people can be born with ambiguous genitals or both genitals or seemingly clear genitals, but then at puberty, things change and you realize the child had been misclassified. Okay? And think about what that would do to you as a person, right? If, your whole life you'd grown up being told you're a little girl, but you might not have always felt that way. And then when you hit puberty, you're like, that's what's been going on. I've been a boy all along. It is hard to know the exact numbers of these cases because, think about it, do all countries around the world have really good national records of, their hospital records for the whole country, or a way to systematically study them? So sometimes hospital records are not there. Sometimes things are not clear. The records, maybe don't go back and change the old ones. But some research says this is probably around 1% of the human population, right? And if you think about, 1%, that's not much. We have 7 billion people on the planet. 1% is like 70 million people, right? That is a lot of people out there who have different kinds of variations here that are not the typical standard X and Y chromosome, male and female body, clear with no, questions. So again, Sapolsky is saying, this is out there and it's natural and it's normal and it's, around. It's just people don't realize it. And another thing that too often happens in situations where a child is born with what is sometimes called ambiguous genitals, right? Is, the doctor and the parents sort of look down there between the legs and they're like, I'm not sure what we have here, right? They're like, that's like a weirdly large clitoris. What they do a lot of times is just say, the doctor says, don't worry, I can sort of trim that down a bit, right? And fix it up so it looks more typical, right? So they'll do a little reconstructive surgery, a little plastic surgery and trim things off and then say, there you go, there's your baby daughter. And then turns out, because of one of these chromosomal disorders, nope, what you've just done is, butcher a male child's genitals. So he brings this up because it's a good thing to keep in mind because, when somebody is pregnant, right, what's the one question that they always get asked, right? Is it a boy or a girl, right? Or, even if you don't ask during pregnancy, when the baby is born, everybody asks, boy or girl, okay? Think of the social pressure on those parents to give a very clear answer of whether it's a son or a daughter, right? What happens if you say, well, I'm not sure, the genitals aren't very clear, we're going to wait a decade or so and let the kid tell us because it's a little iffy. What happens? That may be starting to become an option for parents now, but 50 years ago, could a parent say that? So there's tremendous social pressure to fit into these categories, okay? And these physical categories, people also assume, if you have the body of a male, then that's it. You should be fully male. If you have the body of a female, that's it. You're fully female. That's all there is to it. So this brings Sapolsky to his discussion of being transgender, right? And this is sort of this mixing and blending of sex and gender, right? It's having the physical body of one sex or gender, like having the body of a male, but in your mind feeling like you might be female instead, or having the body of a female and identifying more with male. So it's this issue, right, of the body and the brain agreeing on your identity. He mentions that there is some brain research showing, similar to the way the mice example was before, is that males and females have different areas of their brains that are enlarged and used in different ways, right? Some dimorphic features of the brain, right? That sometimes you can do a brain scan and say, well, that's a male brain because there's a larger part of it here, or that's a female brain because there's a larger part here. And there has been some research, not a ton, but some research taking people who are transgender and having them do, MRI and brain scans. And some of the times the brain matches the gender identity of the person as opposed to their body, sex or gender, right? So they may have male genitals, but their brain looks female. Or they may have female genitals, but their brain looks male. So he's saying there's some research there. So the whole idea of sort of sex and gender and identity is what Sapolsky's point here is saying, we are our brains, right? Your identity is your brain, regardless of what your body may look like. Right? So he has this quote here and there. In other words, it's not that transgendered individuals think they are a different gender than they actually are. It's that they've had the profoundly crappy luck to be stuck with bodies that are a different gender from who they actually are. So this mismatch between what the body looks like and what your identity is. And I'm sure if you think about this, you have had experiences in life where somebody's identity, seems different than what, you think it should be based on their body, right? They may have a different perception of themselves. That happens in lots of aspects of life. And another way to think about it is, right, you are your identity, you are your brain, right? You're not, and that's not necessarily your body, right? Think about if you got into, a terrible car accident, right, and lost your arm, right? Would you be a different person after you lost your arm? I mean, you would still be you, you'd have the trauma of dealing with losing your arm to deal with, right? But you would be you if you lost your arm or if you lost your leg, right? Your brain is your identity, not your body. Think about it. If you got in a terrible car accident and your genitals were damaged, right? Would that change who you were as a person? Would that change your identity? No, because your identity is up here. It's not the same as your body. There's a relationship there, right? And your identity forms in relationship with your body and ideas about your body, but they're not rigidly fixed together, right? As some people think they always are, right? And that just whatever your genitals are, that's who you are. Okay. So I assigned this article because he does a good job of explaining the complexity of biology and nature, right? Just to sort of get away from that idea is that nature is simple and there's only two things, and it's either male or female, and that's all there is. Biology says, no, that's not all there is. There's other things going on. Okay. So, this is the Sapolsky article is sort of setting that up, right? Sex and gender categories in nature are diverse and varied. So we can use that now to go beyond the article and, say, how to set this up. Okay, we can talk about this in cultural terms, right? And I recommend you take a good cultural anthropology class for that, because if you take or have taken a cultural anthropology class, they will usually explore the idea of sex and gender categories cross-culturally around the world, right? In different categories, in different cultures. And some of the examples you'll see in like a cultural anthropology class, which I've taught before, would be, one example would be Indian Hindu culture. Okay. So what you see in Hindu culture are, when you look at sex and gender categories, right? You see the categories of male and female, right, that we are all familiar with. But they have a third category, okay? And that's Hijra. Okay? And this is a social and cultural category for people. And this is typically for people who are born male, but as they go through their life, as they grow up and become adults, they tend to take on female behaviors and roles, right? They identify more with the female roles in society. So there is a well-established, long-standing cultural sex and gender category for people like that, and it's Hijra. And this category, the Hindu culture is quite old, right? This category probably goes back thousands of years, and it ties into their, it's a polytheistic religion with multiple deities. There are some deities that are sort of hermaphroditic or can switch between different genders. So the Hindu culture has known that there are more than two genders for thousands of years, right? This is well known. You can, it's easy to look up information and read about hijras. Here in the United States, though, to bring it closer to home, we see this in a lot of Native American cultures, okay? So Native American cultures are not homogeneous, right? They're not all the same. There's lots of variation in the different Native cultures in the Americas. But if, you compare across cultures, and sometimes when they get together, they use this term called two spirits to talk about this concept, right? Of a mixing of male and female spirits. Okay? But one specific example you can look at are the Navajo, right? Indigenous peoples here of the Southwest. The Navajo have traditionally had 4 gender categories. Navajo had woman, right, which is a stereotypical feminine woman, and they had man, masculine man. But they have 2 other gender categories. They have Nadle, which are what you would think of as feminine men, and Dilba, which would be masculine women, right? So Nadle would be people who have a biologically looking male body, basically with penises and testicles. But as they grow up and become adults, they take on female behaviors, female dress, female social roles. Right? And then Dilba is for the people who grow up with a stereotypical female body, right, with a vagina. And as they grow up, they shift more towards masculine roles and masculine behaviors and a masculine position in society. Right? So again, you see these multiple categories throughout different Native American cultures. The Navajo are just a really well-studied example of it. Okay? And again, these categories are old, okay? I can't tell you how many times I have heard recently, when this idea of, sex and gender and multiple genders come up, I've heard people, I think I heard somebody just like last weekend say, oh, that's a new thing. That's just the new media nowadays. No, that is 100% wrong. There is nothing new about multiple gender categories, okay, and having more categories than male and female. The idea of multiple categories is very, very old. It has been around for thousands of years, and you can see examples of it in different cultures, okay? So what is new then, right? What's changed? Like if this is the example here in the, in our part of the world, right, with the Navajo, what happened to those 4 categories? Why don't most of us grow up learning about these 4 different categories? What changed? Where did those categories go? Anybody know? What changed to take these multiple categories and condense them down into 2? That would be this relatively new religious tradition that popped up, right? This is that monotheistic religious tradition, the Judeo-Christian Islam tradition, right? The Abrahamic religions. Judaism has probably been around, 3,000 to 5,000 years. Christianity and Islam are younger and newer. They're only a couple thousand to 1,000 years old, right? And what are your options for sex and gender categories in this religious system? This religious system says, oh, now there's only two. It's just Adam and Eve, right? That's what's new. That's what's changed, right? This system has come and tried to overwrite all these other ones, right? So in a country like this, where the dominant culture for the past few hundred years has been, this Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition of the Abrahamic religions and of Yahweh, where you only have male or female categories, now you have people thinking, well, this is how it's always been. No, that is not how it's always been. All you got to do is, take a decent culture anthropology class and you'll learn how wrong it is. When this comes around, this tries to wipe out all these other systems, right? So I just wanted you to know that, right? And again, sociology classes will cover this, but definitely culture anthropology classes you'll spend like a whole week on these topics. And they're very fascinating and very interesting. So I just want to bring that up also to say, the next time you hear somebody in the context of these debates about sex and gender, when they start talking about, all this new stuff going on, and no, we need to get back to traditional American cultural values, of sex and gender, they better be talking about these traditional American values of multiple gender categories that have been around for a lot longer than this new stuff that these immigrants brought with them and recently sort of took over. Okay. So, sex and gender, fun stuff to talk about. I love talking about this in class, in person with students, but for this online class, let's try to talk about these sex and gender ideas over in the discussion board this week and see if we can have some good discussions about that. Because this sort of brings us to the idea of sex and gender. Okay, the assumption by some people has been that sex and gender are simple, discontinuous categories, right? When in fact, actually, no, biology, nature, chromosomes, cross-cultural surveys, everything shows, it looks more like continuous variation. Okay? So, sex and gender is not really this. What it is it's more of a distribution. It's more of a continuum, right? There is a high frequency of clustering in these two modes, right? Around stereotypically male and stereotypically female, but there's everything else, right? You can go off in both directions and there's a lot of blending in between, okay? Just, when you're talking to people, relatives or other people, you can point out to them, actually, biology and culture both show it's this, not this. But I'm sure you will still be seeing plenty of these checkboxes in your future for you to identify yourself. So you can choose how you want to identify there, but just realize there are assumptions being made that go into those checkboxes and those categories, and they are relatively recent assumptions that are often fairly ignorant of both biology and culture. Okay. So that's sex and gender. let's also talk a little bit about race, because there's another fun topic to talk about. And again, we're looking at the assumptions, right? The assumptions are about whether race is a discontinuous type of variation between people with a few discontinuous categories, or there is continuous variation. And we can look back to the wonderful days of colonialism to look at some historical views, right? So for colonialism, what I'm talking about is a couple hundred years ago, in the recent history, the past like 500 years, of Europeans hopping on boats and sailing around the world and contacting other people, right? One of the things that Europeans often noticed was skin color, right? In that, hey, these people over here, they're a different shade of skin color than I am. So they did a lot of classifications and categorizations based off of skin color, right? It's like, oh, we're this kind of people, you're that kind of people. But they used all sorts of physical features, right? They used facial features, noses and eyes and lips. Sometimes they even got into weird, skull and head measurements of like how wide or how long or how tall your skull was shaped. These are called cephalic or cranial indexes, trying to use those features to categorize people. Okay. And that, one of the contexts here is, what I talked about, I think the first week of the semester was the scientific revolution, right? Is Europeans are traveling around scientifically classifying things, right? Plants, animals, doing this biological classification project. All the new plants and animals they're finding. They're also finding new people, and they decided, hey, I think we can classify people too into scientific categories. Okay. So this is what we're going to look at. Do you guys remember from the beginning of the semester? It's like, how long ago was that? 3-4 months ago. I talked about Linnaeus. Right? Have any vague memories of Linnaeus? I mentioned this classification system, right? The kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. King Philip came over for good soup, or kinky people come over for good sex, whatever. Right? This system. Okay. Linnaeus was a preeminent biologist in the 1700s, and he came up with this system of classifying and naming all the plants and animals. Okay. All right. So I want to bring this up because this biology system that Linnaeus gave us, this taxonomic system from the 1700s, is still used today in biology, right? This gives us these scientific names, okay? We saw during the hominin evolution month about the fossils, right? You guys remember there were always lots of debates about, oh, is this species different? Is this fossil a different species than the fossil over here, right? Do we have a new species here? And part of the problem was Linnaeus was a very religious guy. He was a Christian, and he believed in divine creation and the fixity of species, right? He believed God created everything in its present form and nothing ever changes. So he said everything gets a nice, clear, simple name. So when you're studying change in the fossil record, it got messy and confusing, right? There was the debate of, oh, is it, Homo habilis or Homo rudolfensis? Is it Homo erectus or Homo ergaster? Sorry, does Heidelbergensis get its own name, or is it archaic Homo sapiens, right? Are Neanderthals a separate species, or they are Homo sapien neanderthalensis, right? All those debates and frustration of using this system by studying fossil changes. Okay, so we've already dealt with some difficulties of Linnaeus. Today, I bring him back up again, because not only did he give us a system, right, and give us the scientific name for Homo sapiens, right, and give us our species name, but he also had the idea that, well, actually, if you look closely at Homo sapiens, what you'll find is there are some subspecies there, right? Is that we're not all the same. There's some distinct biological subspecies categories within Homo sapiens. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you Linnaeus's description of these biological subspecies, right? And we're going to talk a little bit about some ideas of like science and colonialism and biological determinism. Okay, so my next slide is Linnaeus's description as a biologist, his biological description of the 4 distinct subspecies within Homo sapiens. So here you go. I will let you read this for a moment peacefully, and then we'll talk about it. So enjoy. Okay, I assume you've read through this, and you may have noticed some things in here. This slide is usually very good for creating some discussion in the classroom. It's harder to deal with this slide online, but hopefully if you've got some ideas and impressions here, we can try to deal with them and talk about them over in the discussion board this week. But I think some of the things you might notice here is some of these seem to be wrong. Some of these traits and features do not seem very accurate. They seem a bit subjective, not very objective all the time, that there are some value judgments here. And remember, my whole point here is this is Linnaeus giving you the biological, supposedly just biological facts, right? Objective biological facts of the different subspecies of people, right? The Homo sapiens you find in the Americas, the Native Americans, the Homo sapiens you find native to the continent of Africa, the Homo sapiens you find native to the Asian regions, and the Homo sapiens you find up in Europe. So these are flawed, these are subjective. And another thing, are all of these traits biology? Right? He's saying one of the biological traits is whether as a people you are governed by whim or customs or opinions or laws. He's saying it is biology that Europeans wear close vestments, close-fitting clothing versus loose garments versus grease versus body paint. Okay? He's saying this is all biology. All right, so this brings me, there's 2 important concepts here. This is the idea of biological determinism, right? The idea that your biology, what we now think of as our genes and DNA, determine everything about you, right? Your biology determines your general personality type, your posture, your facial features, your attitude, how you dress, how your society structures its governments, right? He says that's all biology. It's 100 completely biologically determined. What he is not recognizing here is culture, right? The difference between features of people that are biological and features of peoples that are cultural in nature. This is assuming it's all the same. And then I do want to point out how this fits into colonialism, right? So which group does Linnaeus belong to? I assume you can guess he's a European fellow, right? And I'm sure it's just accidental that they happen to sound so nice and wonderful here, right? Well, all the other groups, maybe less so. All right, so what is happening during this time period? I mentioned colonialism before, right? What are those Europeans doing? They're sailing around the world, visiting other people, right? But are they just vacationing and saying hi and then coming back home with snapshots? No, right? What the Europeans are doing is they're going out and colonizing, establishing colonies and taking over areas, right? Why? Why are they going out and establishing colonies, right? What is their goal? What are they trying to do, right? Anybody who's taken a basic history class knows they're out there getting resources, right, to bring back to their country, right? They're going out to get wealth and resources. But how does this fit into that, okay? To get those resources, they're going out and wiping out and conquering, and taking over all sorts of groups of people. Well, why are the Europeans going out and conquering everybody? If you look at biology, what does this tell you about why the Europeans are conquering everybody? Why? Look, it's because they're just biologically superior to everyone else. They're just so awesome. They almost can't even help conquering the rest of the world. All those other poor people that are limited by their, defective biology, they don't even have a chance. Okay. So this fits in perfectly well with the social and cultural goals, right, of these empires to go out and crush and conquer and take resources. Is biology is giving them cover for this and saying, well, yeah, of course you are, because Europeans are just so superior with their long flowing hair, Woo. Okay, so Europeans love this idea of biology says, science says we're awesome and everybody else sucks. All right, so Linnaeus was clearly a fucking racist bastard, right? He was a terrible, terrible person. He was a terrible person that gave us a really kind of shitty naming system that, causes us nothing but trouble. So I just, you probably, again, learned about Linnaeus's taxonomic system in high school, but you probably didn't learn about his racism. There you go. All right. So moving on from Linnaeus, we can move into sort of what we can think of now as more modern science, right? And modern scientists have come in and, started to question that shoddy science, that those old ideas were based on. Big social events have happened, like World War II happened, where people started to see what happens when you take ideas about biological determinism and racism to extremes. And they're like, oh, maybe there's a problem with those ideas. Maybe. So now we can look at this with a modern scientific perspective where we can bring in good ideas of natural selection, combining genetics and Darwinian evolution, all into sort of what's an adaptationist perspective, right? Understanding how things adapt and change over time. So that was sort of my setup for the other article, the race article that we talked about, that was in the student presentation and you guys talked about over there. So the main points, there are 3 main points of that race article. Number one is that there were never there never have been, never were any biologically distinct archaic human subspecies, right? That's Linnaeus's idea of distinct subspecies. No, that is wrong. As we covered last week, right, when we were talking about the origins of Homo sapiens, right? What we saw is Homo sapiens as a species, we evolved in Africa. And then as our population grew, we spread and diversified. And there has been continuous migration of people, out of Africa, back into Africa, through Asia, through Europe. Everybody's been mingling and interbreeding with each other, even interbreeding with the occasional Neanderthal sometimes, right? So the human population, everybody mates with and breeds with their neighbors. We've been mingling the whole time. So there's never been any time where there's been any like pure human races or groups, because as we've grown and spread, we've always mingled and interbred with each other. Okay? So historically, there were never distinct subspecies, right? There's just one species spreading out all over the place. And then if you look at humans now, humans are not divisible into biological races, is the main point of this article, right? Modern racial categories that use biological traits, the use of those biological traits tend to be subjective. They're not very objective. They're just based on opinions about people's personal appearance, and they're inconsistent. And one of their very important points here is that there is more biological variability within any given racial category than between them, right? Is that within any racial category, you can find every variation of person in there, in all of those features you're talking about, right? Hair, nose, eyes, skin tones, all that kind of stuff, right? There's more variation within a group than between any group you come up with. And even if you do have these biological categories that you're using, they're not these racial categories. There's no good biology behind them. And they don't have much scientific value at all. Because, unlike Linnaeus, Linnaeus thought your biology determined all of your behaviors and determined your culture. Turns out, no, your biology does not determine your culture and your behaviors, right? Culture and behaviors are not limited to your genes. Right? And even in the cases of medicine, they're not actually very useful. They're more likely to make people misdiagnose, overdiagnose, underdiagnose, just completely miss things if they're too focused on racial categories, rather than the individual person sitting in front of them that they're trying to diagnose or treat. So it's just not a useful category in any way. So what they say is, race is not historically accurate. It's not based on biology, and it's not scientifically useful, right? What race is, right? Racial categories are social constructions. They're not biology, right? And they have more to do with creating social divisions, identity. A lot of times it's all about power and privilege. Who has the power, who doesn't? This group gets to have power, that group does not. And historically, it has been used since colonial times as an ideology for legitimizing inequality between groups, right? Like I was saying before with Linnaeus, why are Europeans going out and conquering and crushing and colonizing everyone? Because they're biologically superior, right? So they just can't help it. That kind of idea, right? Is that some people are just biologically superior than others. So it's used as sort of a social tool in that way. All right. So what we get here is remember this concept of biological determinism, right? That your biology determines everything about you. No, that is not accurate, right? That's a false idea. It's this claim that behavior, intelligence, morality, it's all controlled by your genes, and it's all the same thing. And it's often sort of an inaccurate association between behaviors and physical attributes. Okay. So these ideas were really clear in the Linnaeus slide, right? Is his categories. You saw how he was biologically defining different groups of people and saying your biology makes you, this kind of person and, this kind of society. The modern form of this idea, right? You can look at Linnaeus' slides and say, oh no, that's total crap. People in the 1700s were stupid. There are threads of those ideas that still follow through to society today. Have you ever heard that Asians are better at math than other people? That's biological determinism. That's claiming there's something about that Asian biology that gives them a special math gene. No. There was this book published in the 90s about the bell curve, basically saying that some racial groups just had advantages over others, right? And were better than others. This is total crap. Gould wrote a book, The Mismeasure of Man, basically debunking all of this. Right? There's no evidence that there's any racial variations in intelligence or abilities, right? There's no science to back that up. Social and culture influences are there, right? And, there are things you guys probably are relatively familiar now with ideas about structural racism, right? Long-standing historical patterns of racism due to social inequality and social power that you can see, in things like the American education system, that can put some racial groups at disadvantages to others because of these historical patterns of inequality, right? So when you see variation there, between groups, it's social and cultural reasons that are going on there, right? And of course, there's variations between individuals, right? Individual people can excel at different things, but you can find individuals that excel in all the different racial groups, right? So again, I think if you take a good sociology class, they will unpack this and deal with this in great depth for like American culture and show you where the flaws are in these kinds of thinking, this kind of thinking in American culture, because it's still around, and you probably have some relatively poorly educated racist relatives who might be spouting ideas like this. So again, I can only do so much in a bioanthropology class, but this is to say, again, culture anthropology can unpack this, sociology can unpack this, even good psychology classes can get into this. So just know there is no science backing up, different races have different abilities over each other. Okay, but I do want to talk about something that often comes into discussions about race from the 1700s up until now, and that is skin color. Okay. So let's take this is a biology class, biological anthropology class. I can deal with this aspect of it in some detail. Okay, skin color. That is a biological trait, right? It is controlled by genes, right? And it varies between people. There are differences between people in their skin color, and that's biology, thanks to biology, right? So let's look at that. Let's look at that variation and see. What I want to look at is skin color discontinuous variation or is it continuous variation? So another way to ask this is how many different skin colors are there out there? Are there a few discontinuous color variations? or are there an infinite number of color variations? So what I'll show you to help out with this discussion, I guess it's more of a thought experiment here on an online class. So here's a map showing the skin colors of indigenous, right? Indigenous meaning native peoples, right? All around the world. Okay. So what do we see there, right? Does this look like discontinuous variation or continuous variation? How many different shades of skin color are here? 2, 3, 4, 5, 10? Hopefully what you can see is that what we have is a continuum, right? A variation from dark to light, okay? And everything in between. Okay, so it is a spectrum. It is a continuous spectrum of skin color, right? It's not discontinuous categories. There's, every shade from darkest to lightest and everything in between. You can always find somebody who's an in-between shade between any other two people. All right, so this is continuous variation, and it's a biological trait. And you can look at a map like that and say, is it random how skin color is distributed on the map? Is it random, or does it look like there's a pattern here? Right. Hopefully you can see a pattern. Okay, this doesn't look to be random. What's the pattern? Right. When biologists see a pattern in a biological trait, they can look at it and say, I wonder if this is evolution and an adaptation going on here. Okay. And what this pattern has to do is the pattern is related to the equator. Okay. It's not exactly related to temperature and heat. That's only sort of part of the story. Okay. What it has to do with the equator and sunlight and the intensity of sunlight. Okay. So let's take a look at sunlight and the evolution of skin color. All right. Now, you guys know UV rays can be harmful, right? What have you heard about UV rays being harmful? How do they harm you? What damage does UV rays do? Okay. I assume most of you, if you're actually paying attention and thinking right now, you're thinking, oh, like sunburns and skin cancer. Okay, that's true. Okay, there is a connection with UV rays and skin cancer. But what I want to ask you is, typically, on average, how old are people usually when they start getting skin cancer? Like, what age group has the highest rates of skin cancer? Skin cancer usually happens to you a bit later in life, right? 50s and 60s, relatively high rates of skin cancer, right? Okay. So in biological evolutionary terms, skin cancer happens relatively late in life, so it has not been has not had a really big influence on our biological evolution in terms of reproductive success. Because by that age, you're usually done with your reproduction, right? In your 50s and 60s. So it doesn't affect your reproduction too much. So the more important effect that UV rays have on evolution is that UV rays destroy folate, right? The ultraviolet rays from the sun destroy your folate in your cells, okay? Folate is also known as vitamin B9. So UV rays penetrate your cells and destroy this vital vitamin, okay? And how it impacts reproduction is that if you have low folate levels, right, you have a higher risk of having a miscarriage if you're female, or giving birth to a baby with birth defects. Or if you're male, low folate levels can lower your sperm count. So this is a direct impact on reproductive success, right? UV rays damaging your chances of reproducing. Yeah. So you can keep that in mind if you're one of those people who go hang out in tanning beds. You're basically sterilizing yourself. So that's the danger of UV rays. And yes, of course, UV rays can cause skin cancer too. So, it's good to worry about that as an individual. But in evolutionary terms, folate is the main issue. And folate is so important to healthy pregnancies that if you are pregnant or thinking about getting pregnant, your doctor will often prescribe prenatal vitamins. Those are multivitamins with a lot of extra folate to make sure you have a healthy pregnancy. So, hooray for folic acid. It gives you, helps you have a healthy pregnancy. So UV rays, dangerous. But UV rays are also beneficial, okay? Do you guys know what's the good part about UV rays? What's the benefit of UV rays? One of the main benefits of UV rays, there's a few benefits, but one of the main ones in evolutionary terms has to do with vitamin D. Is your body, your cells use UV rays to make vitamin D. And vitamin D is necessary to absorb calcium and build your bones. You need it for muscle growth. You need it to have a healthy immune system. Low vitamin D levels can also make you depressed, right? That's probably why all those Pacific Northwest, Seattle hipsters and stuff are all depressed and moody because they have low vitamin D. No, that's a different issue. But vitamin D is important, and your body uses UV rays to make it, okay, to have healthy bones and a whole bunch of other health issues. So your body has to do two things, right? It's got to protect itself and protect itself from UV rays and get UV rays. Okay? So to protect the skin and folate, okay? How does your body protect your skin cells and protect your precious folate supplies from UV rays? And again, we're talking evolutionary terms, evolutionary context. I'm not talking about going down to CVS and buying some sunscreen, right? In an evolutionary context, what protects your skin from UV rays? We talked about this a few weeks ago, like a month ago. Melanin. Melanin protects your folate. Melanin is the pigment in your cells that bounces UV rays off and keeps your folate levels healthy, okay? So the more melanin you have, the darker your skin, right? And the more protected you are from UV rays. But your body and your cells also need to synthesize vitamin D, okay? So they don't want to block out all the UV rays. So you need to balance that with having less melanin. You want lighter skin to get your vitamin D. So your body and your skin has to do this balancing act. Keep out too much UV radiation, let in enough UV radiation. And this is where we get back to the map, right? There is geographical variation in UV intensity, right? Where is ultraviolet light the most intense? At the equator, right? Where is UV light, where are UV rays the weakest? At the poles. Okay? So you guys understand this? Folate, vitamin D, reproductive success, melanin. All right. So if you look at a map here, this is a map showing you where there's enough UV radiation to synthesize vitamin D, okay? So this is basically showing you here at the equator in this sort of dark, what is this, dark red, maroon color, right? In the tropics, there is sufficient UV radiation year-round. You always have plenty of UV radiation to make your vitamin D. No worries there. Okay, so there's an abundance of UV radiation here. But as you move away from the equator and start moving farther and farther north, right, this brighter red area is at least 1 month a year, right, probably in the winter, there is not enough UV radiation to make your vitamin D. Right? As you move up here, UV radiation is starting to get really weak. Most of the year, there's not enough UV rays, right? So UV radiation gets weaker as you go away, and you start running into problems with vitamin D as you go farther up. So how does skin color respond to that? Here at the equator, right, you have lots of melanin, right, to protect yourself because there's so much UV radiation, you're never going to run out of vitamin D. You're perfectly fine. So keep out most of the UV radiation. But then as you move north and the UV radiation gets weaker and weaker and weaker, you need to lessen the amount of melanin you have to let in some UV radiation because you're only going to get enough UV radiation sometimes in the year, like probably in the summer. The rest of the year, the UV radiation is weak. You're probably covered in clothing. So you need light skin to let in as much as you can to get your vitamin D for the year. Does that make sense? Equator, UV radiation, melanin, folate, vitamin D, how it works out on a map there. If you have any questions about this, you can ask it over in the discussion board this week. So I want to use that and sort of put this all together into one slide. Right? Is the evolution of human skin color. All right. For this, we got to jump back in time. Okay. We jump back, let's say about 6 million years, okay, to our last common ancestor with the living apes, with like chimps. And these apes, if you remember, they were living in the forests of Africa, you know, and they had bodies a lot like chimps and bonobos. I think I mentioned to you early on, no, like in the middle of the semester when we were talking about chimps. Yeah, it was like mid-semester. Did I show you a picture one time of chimpanzees without fur? Some hairless chimps. I think I might have put that in a lecture somewhere. Do you remember what they look like? What the skin color of a chimpanzee is if you shave them? They have relatively light skin under there, okay? Because their skin is protected by fur. Okay, so that is our starting point for the evolution of skin color, right? Is all the early hominins had light skin under dark fur, like we see in all the living apes, okay? The African apes, the chimps, the bonobos, and gorillas. All right, so they're going about their lives with light skin underneath that dark fur. Do you guys remember when that changed? Hopefully you remember. You probably had an exam question about this. You remember our old friend Homo erectus from like a month ago in class? Homo erectus evolved 2 million years ago in Africa. And what was different about Homo erectus? You guys remember? I hope so. Homo erectus was the species that lost their fur, right? They became relatively hairless because they were the species that was running. Remember, they got like 6 feet tall, long legs, hairless bodies, sweating. There was a whole article about this. Was it The Naked Truth? And I mentioned when you lost your fur and now you're exposed to UV rays, what do you need to protect yourself? This is where, in our ancestry, dark skin first evolved, right? On the savannas of Africa, Homo erectus had to increase their melanin as they lost their fur. So more melanin to protect their folate levels from UV rays. This is the adaptation that kept them alive and kept them reproducing well as their fur went away. Okay. And I think I also mentioned the hair on their head at this point. I'm pretty sure I talked about this. Tightly curled hair to keep the head shaded and cool, let the air evaporate, let the water evaporate as the air flows through it. So that's what Homo sapiens look like. That's what Homo erectus looked like 2 million years ago. Now, Homo sapiens, we evolved 200,000 years ago in Africa, right? Homo erectus evolved into Heidelbergensis, that evolved into Homo sapiens. So Homo sapiens evolved in Africa 200,000 years ago. What did they look like? What physical features did Homo sapiens have? Dark skin and tightly curled hair, right? They'd inherited that from Homo erectus because they're still at the equator in the tropics, without fur. They needed that dark skin and tightly curled hair, the dark skin and melanin to protect their folate. So that's how our species evolved, right? In Africa with dark skin. Then we talked about this last week, right? They stay in Africa for a while, and then they start migrating out around 60,000 years ago. They head into Asia. And it looks like around 50,000 years ago, they move north into Central Asia, right? They're getting away from the equator, getting into a higher latitude. So what happens now, right? UV rays are getting weaker and weaker and weaker. So how do they change and adapt to that? Now they got to back off on the melanin. Lighter skin would have evolved as they moved farther north so that they could synthesize enough vitamin D to stay healthy. That makes sense? Moving away from the equator, getting lighter skin because your folate's not in danger anymore. Now you're in danger of having low vitamin D levels. I think this is where straight hair probably evolved too. Because remember, the tightly curled hair lets your head stay cool, lets the sweat evaporate as the air flows through. Straight hair like this sucks at keeping you cool, but it does provide a little warmth. So a mutation for straight hair may have popped up and spread around at this stage because it wouldn't be fatal anymore. So then these light-skinned people, they migrated further throughout East Asia, and they migrated into Europe. Okay. And also, where did they migrate from East Asia? They migrated across the Bering Strait, that frozen ice bridge, into North America, what's now modern day Alaska and Canada. And then as they came down and headed towards Central and South America, headed toward the equator down there, skin got dark again as they started getting more intense UV rays after about 15,000 years ago. Okay. Does that make sense? You guys understand that series of events? Hopefully you can explain that back to me, maybe like in an exam answer somewhere. This fits back into our map here of dark skin, lightning as we move up into weak UV rays in Asia, and then Homo sapiens move across here, and as they move down, the skin darkens up a bit more as they get towards the tropics again. Okay, so what I want to go back to now is this idea of skin color. We know how and why it evolved in our evolutionary history, what its function is. Now we can look back and say, are there racial categories here? Okay. Are there distinct biological racial categories based on skin color? So to think about this, what I want you to think about is most of you, I think, are familiar with the racial categories here in the United States, right? And you're probably familiar with the categories of black and white, right? So what I want you to think about is, for this example, black, right? Being African American. What is the phenotype, right? The physical features that make you black, that define somebody as African American? What physical features come to mind when you think of African American? I assume most of you may have a few different features in mind, but most of you are going to say dark skin and maybe even tightly curled hair, right? Does that make sense to you? Those two features, they're black features, not white features, right? And they're African American, right? Features. Okay. So thinking about that, thinking about how we define race categories here and the physical features of racial categories. So if we look at this picture, okay? So who do you think in this picture is African? Right? Or a very recent African ancestry, I guess. Who looks African? Who has those African features that we were just talking about? The dark skin and the curly hair. So I assume you've taken a look at all these people and come up with some ideas. So for this, nobody here is African. All the people in the top row are from the Philippines, Southeast Asia, right? And all the people down here are from Australia. Right? So why do they look African, right? Why do they have dark skin and curly hair? Because, let me go back to the map I showed you a few minutes ago. Look at this map. So dark skin and curly hair evolved in Africa, right? 2 million years ago with Homo erectus, right? Then Homo sapiens evolved here 200,000 years ago. And then 60,000 years ago, they come out of Africa. And where did they go first? First, they go east and they just migrate here along Southeast Asia, right? And down here to Australia. They get to Australia by about 45,000 years ago. So the first wave of human migration is out of Africa along here. So here you go. Why do the people in the Philippines and Australia look African? Well, they have black, dark skin and curly hair because their ancestors have been living in the tropics, right? They never lost those features because those are not African features. They're tropical high UV ray habitat features. And that's what we see here. So those people kept them, right? And you find dark skin and tightly curled hair way over here, way the hell and gone away far from Africa, right? So that's one of the concepts I want you to see, is that the phenotypic features, the physical features that we associate with one race don't always match up. They're not consistent, right? Because dark skin and curly hair, you find them in Asians and Australians, right? It's not limited to Africans. You find these features elsewhere in the world. Okay. So I realized that picture was kind of a little bit of a trick. This next one is not. Okay. This next one is soccer teams, football teams around the world. One of these teams is not African. One and only one is not African. So I'll give you a sec to look at that and find which one is not the African team. Okay, you ready? Which one's not the African team? It's the French team down here is not African. Everybody else is from Africa. Right? So, why is the French team so dark? Right? Well, that's a history of colonialism, right? And recent patterns of immigration, right? People who have moved there in the past few hundred years. Okay? That's what makes the French team so dark. But everybody else is really dark. But look over here at the Algerian team, right? Algeria. Do you guys know where Algeria is? Just do a quick little Google search on your phone. Algeria is Northern Africa. Look how light they are. This is a team of 100% Africans, right? Why are they so light? Okay. It's because Northern Africans tend to be somewhat lighter. Okay. If you look at people from Northern Africa, they have relatively light skin, right? Why? Because they're getting fairly far from the equator, right? So there's less UV rays, less intense UV rays there. So there's less need for melanin. So Northern Africans can sometimes have very fair skin. So why do we in the United States think, oh, Africans are dark, right? That's because if you look at sub-Saharan Africans, right, people from south of the Sahara Desert, closer to the equator, this is where you get the dark skin and the tightly curled hair, right? Those features that we associate with Africa, okay? So why, when you ask the typical American, right, United Statesian, right, why do you, when you ask them, what does an African look like, right? Why is it this image and not this image? Right? Why do we associate Africa, dark skin? It's, I mean, it is true that a lot of Americans don't travel much and they haven't gotten out of the country and seen the rest of the world. But, there's also a very good historical reason. And that's, the United States, history with slavery, right? What part of Africa did most of the slaves in the United States come from? West Africa, sub-Saharan West Africa. So for hundreds of years, the majority of Africans, of people with African descent in the United States, came from sub-Saharan Africa, and they had features like this, right? We just have not had as big and long a history. We haven't had as many people from Northern Africa coming over to the United States. So people in the United States think of Africans as looking like this because they only know one subset of African people very well, and that's West Africans. So that's why Americans associate that feature with Africans. But when I was saying before, when I was summarizing the article, when I was saying that the traits we use, when we use physical traits to characterize racial groups, saying there is more variation within one racial group than between racial groups, this is the idea I was talking about, right? Within African, there is the whole range of very dark to very light, right? You get the whole spectrum. So there's tons of variation within the racial group African. And if you look outside, you even see, Asians with just as dark features as Africans do. So there's no real variation between groups. All the variation is within groups. Hopefully that makes sense to you guys. Using the one trait I can deal with well in this class, biology, biological anthropology class, I can deal with skin color and melanin because there's a good evolutionary explanation for that, and it fits into what we've been talking about. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense to you guys. Some examples here. So again, what I want to emphasize is that, you will hear sometimes in readings and people say, race is not real. If you're saying that more carefully, race is not biologically real, right? Race is not a biological category, right? There's no way to define it biologically. Race is real because it is a socially constructed category, right? They are social categories, and they have huge impacts on people's lives. And a lot of it comes down to power and social inequality. So that's what race is, and that's what the categories are, right? It's not biology. It's social cultural categories. So again, if you want to explore race in depth, cultural anthropology is a good class for that. Sociology is a good class for that, right? All I can say is race is not biology. It's not something that we can fully explain in a biological anthropology class. I can just kind of give you some pointers to say what it's not, and to say why trying to classify it as biology is very problematic. Okay, that's what I wanted to cover this week. Hopefully clearly explaining to you how, sex, gender, and race, none of those are simple biology. They're not discontinuous, simple little categories. All of those have a biological influence, but the biology behind it is continuous variation, right? And that, goes against some of the more narrow-minded historical assumptions that people have been making about these categories. Hopefully you enjoyed the lecture today and found it interesting. Ask me any questions you want over in the discussion board this week, and hopefully we'll have some interesting conversations about it. Thanks for making it to the end. See you guys in the discussion.